What's the most bizarre coincidence you've ever experienced? Story one was going to a trivia night with my roommate. I invited my friend from high school. He invited his college friend from all the way across the country. When they saw each other, they went, "Oh, long time no see." They had met that morning off Facebook to tour an apartment and had just decided to become roommates. Mine's a roommate too. I'm a woman, and my post college roommate in Austin, Texas was a man the same age that I met on Craigslist. It was many moons ago, and he turned out to be a great roommate and lifelong friend. He was from Baltimore and went to college on the East Coast, and I was from Houston and went to college in Austin. My roommate had his high school friend visiting for the weekend from Baltimore. They didn't go to the same college. We three decided to go out, and my roommate's friend says he has a college friend coming up from Houston to join us at the bar and hang out for the week. It turns out to be my high school crush. We started a fling that weekend and ended up dating for years. While we aren't still together, we're good friends, and I'll always be grateful to him for being such a positive influence. Story two. When I was in college as a foreigner, I got hit by a car, and some dude was kind enough to get my stuff, call an ambulance, help me call my family. Due to the shock, I couldn't remember him, and I had to take a semester off because I broke my hip into two parts. When I got back to school, he was in the same class as me, and he showed me my dad's contact with his name as proof he and I became friends. Story three. I was on a date with a girl once, and we were driving in my car to wherever we were going. I was telling her a story about a friend of mine who had recently gotten rear-ended right as we were stopping at a red light. While I was telling her the story, a car in the next lane went flying past and rear-ended a stopped car. As I was talking and saw it, I pointed to it and said, "It was just like that right there." It took a few seconds for it to sink in. How strange of a coincidence. Story four. This is kind of a funny one, but about 5 or 6 years ago, my wife and I moved out of NYC and bought a house in the town we both grew up in. I was in a local CVS where a blind woman asked if I would help her find a couple of things, organize her money, then call a cab for her. I said sure, helped her shop, organized her, then called her a cab. I felt bad leaving here, so I waited until the cab showed up and told the driver that she wanted to go to the post office. I got home and my wife asked me what took so long, so I told her about the blind woman. Later on, we were at my parents' for a barbecue, and my wife told my mom she raised a good son, then went on to explain about the blind woman. My mom said that was so funny because my dad helped a blind woman earlier in the day, too. She got out of a cab and asked my dad if he minded helping her with the post office's doors. It turns out I put her in a cab in CVS, and about 2 miles down the road, my dad helped her out LOL. What are the odds? Story 5. My family had a shadow family. They lived a block away from us and had the same street address with a different street. So our address was 34,827 Main Street, and theirs was 34,827. This is how we learned of them. Mail kept getting crossed. Our last names shared the same first letter and number of letters. They had two kids, the same age as myself and my brother. Our first names shared the same first letter. We got a dog, they got a dog. Same litter. From a town about 250 miles away. The breeder named the dogs after famous people. First name went to our dog, last name to their dog. Oh, and the dogs were the only ones of those breeds that I saw for about 15 years. Story 6. At the 50-year anniversary of the end of World War I, an American veteran was retracing his steps where he had been stationed in Florence, Italy. I was working as an au pair for a lovely family and was idling my time at a cafe when he asked me for directions to Via Maggio. He seemed lost, and we asked where he was headed. He was looking for Via Di Michelozzi. We narrowed it down, and ultimately, I told him that I could guarantee that his old girlfriend did not still live at that apartment because I lived there myself. We were able to track down the woman who had rented the apartment during the war because the building was owned by the family I was working for. Everyone was very excited about all of this. And we ended up hosting that American veteran for dinner at the apartment. Story 7, I'm quite possibly the most embarrassing moment of my young life. When on holiday at a Butlins-type caravan park, I went looking for my mom in a crowded arcade to ask for more coins, thought I saw her, so ran up behind her and gave her a hug, only to find it was a complete stranger. My actual mom was watching from a nearby table and laughing her ass off at me. The imposter mom brought me over to the table and ended up chatting with my mom. Then my younger siblings turned up with two random kids in tow, saying they'd made some new friends. Could we sit with them at the entertainment that night? It was that lady's kids. Both families ended up getting along really well, and we hung out most of the week, but didn't really keep in touch. 3 years later, we went to visit my aunt in Greece, where she was living at the time, and on the beach one day, someone came up behind me and gave me a surprise hug. Same family again. We ended up keeping in touch for several years after that. Story 8. My family has been going to the same beach in Florida since my dad was a kid. When I was in junior high school, I met this really cute girl on the beach and hit it off really well. But she was staying at a hotel a few buildings north of us and was leaving a few days before we did so. We only got to hang out for like 2 solid days. I made the mistake of not getting her phone number, pre-cell phone era. And when she left, I felt like I would never see her again. That was 1999. In 2010, I was in college in Michigan, And at a party, when I saw this girl walk by and stop to talk with one of my roommates. She looked super familiar, so I went and said hi, and it turned out to be that same girl from the beach all those years ago. We hit it off and spent the next few hours chatting. We eventually dated for a little over a year, but broke up due to distance. Story 9, did a project in college in Georgia with a girl that lived with her brother. At the end of the project, I invited everyone who worked on the project over for dinner and also invited her brother. They had hosted us for dinner while we worked on the project several times, had a great meal, finished the project, and never talked to them. Fast forward 10 years, I went to a conference on the opposite side of the country with one of my coworkers. The conference was near where he used to live, work, and he said, "Hey, let's get lunch with some of my old friends." So we met them at In and Out. One of the friends was the brother of the girl I did the project with. I couldn't even believe it was happening. It felt so surreal. Story 10, one time. I worked at a pizza place as a driver, but somehow my bag was missing a $20 bill after returning. I looked all over my car in a parking lot multiple times and couldn't find it. I have no idea what happened to it. I'm generally a careful person when it comes to stuff like that. My manager said if you can't find it by tomorrow or something, he'd just have to take it out of my check. Next day, I come into work and I'm walking through the parking lot and there's $20 on the ground, just out in the middle of the busy parking lot. I don't know if it was that $20 that fell out of the bag or just a $20 someone else dropped. I went in and said, "You're not going to believe this, but I found this $20 in the parking lot, so here you go." He just laughed and shrugged and said, "Good enough." Story 11. This happened just yesterday. I was downtown waiting in my truck outside of a job site to meet a man, who we will call Steve, for a job walk. I had never met Steve face to face. Another truck pulled into the parallel parking spot behind me, and a man got out with his leather-bound folder in hand. I got out of my truck and approached the man with my hand extended for a handshake and said, "Steve?" The man said, "Yes," and extended his hand with a confused look on his face. His name was Steve too, but it wasn't the Steve I was there to meet. We had a laugh about the coincidence. Story 12. Back in 95, I was friends with a girl. We were about 14 to 15 years old. One day she called late at night, my mom answering and handing the phone to me. She was calling to say goodbye. Thankfully, I was able to talk her out of it after speaking to her for hours. She called again a few days later, thanking me for saving her life, but saying her family was moving her away. We lost touch. Fast forward to about a year ago, I stumbled upon a picture she gave me and thought to look her up on social media, hoping she was living a good life. Turns out she's the girl my old best friend, best man at my wedding married, and had a kid with a few years back. I hadn't recognized her as she went from blonde to brunette and wasn't using the same first name iteration. I haven't spoken with my old friend in years, but I think it's fun how they might not realize they both know me and a connection. I can't imagine my old friend having many pictures of me lying around. As we were kids in the 90s, not many pictures left of them, so unless she saw one and recognized me, they might not realize it. Story 13. I was sitting at a bar enjoying an adult beverage. It was a slow time, 11:30 a.m. I was Christmas shopping, don't judge me. Having a few drinks in you makes it so much easier. Plus, when they open the gift, you're both surprised. Well, the younger person walks in, sits down, and orders lunch and a beer. Since they're young and it's one of those corporate mall restaurants, the bartender asks for ID. The bartender recites the date. "Hey, that's my birthday too." Not that weird, but it was also the same date as my birthday. So in a bar with three people in it, all three people were strangers, and all three had the same exact birth month and day. I understand there's a 1 out of 365 chance of that happening with two people, but with three, that number is insert math here. But to me, that's my most bizarre coincidence. Story 14. High school quiz bowl. We got a bonus question about an English dude who went off to sea as a teenager and returned in his 20s to write a book about his travel. He supposedly fought against the Spanish, turned pirate, then later fought for the Habsburgs in the Ottoman-Austrian War, fought in duels, was captured and sold as a slave, and then escaped. None of us had a clue, so we just stared at each other, and our captain answered, "Smith." The moderator said, "More specifically, please." Our captain kind of looked at us wildly and said, John." It was correct because that's the same guy who went to Jamestown in Virginia later on and was involved with the Powhatan tribe and Pocahontas. Story 15. Meeting my former high school biology teacher 16 years later at the vet hospital I currently work at and have been part of the team for the past 1.5 years. Apparently, she had been a client of this particular hospital back when I was still in high school. The iguana she had in her bio classroom and who she would occasionally let wander around the class was a previous patient there before he was euthanized for declining health. The vet hospital isn't even located in the same city as the high school she used to teach at either. Even more bizarre is that another biology teacher from the same high school is also a client, and he was my sister's freshman bio teacher. Story 16. New neighbors, a couple, moved into the flat next to mine. They seemed nice enough, About a year later, I got a new job at an office. Maybe 2 months after that, the neighbors went on holiday, and their friend was house sitting for them. I tend to not notice things, so I wasn't really paying attention to who the house sitter was until a woman approached me at work. She helped me and the other people who started when I did with admin stuff and onboarding and sent regular emails about office stuff. She asked me if I lived in suburb and if I lived next to a neighbor's name. Turns out she and her partner were the ones house sitting, and I'd not noticed for almost 2 months at that point. Both of them were friends with my neighbors and had been for years. I hadn't even realized there was a second person there because I never saw the partner. Apparently, I have the situational awareness turnip. Story 17. We were having a very windy day, and I stepped outside of my house to go somewhere. As I stepped out, I heard a loud crack and looked across the road to see a large branch break off a tree and fall into the road. I was startled and wondering if I should go and check the number for the local park service to report it when I happened to glance at the line of vehicles, slowing to maneuver around the fallen branch. Slightly back in the line was a park service truck towing a wood chipper. They pulled in next to the branch, and it was gone by the time I returned from my errand. Since the branch literally fell as I was watching it, they obviously weren't there specifically for that one, but given how windy it was, I'm guessing that they were traveling to or from another fallen branch tree and just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Story 18. I've told this on Reddit before. One morning I was with my dad and he stopped at the post office for his mail. He gave me his keys and I went and got it. As he was going through it, he said, "My keys." "Oh, right," I said and handed them back. He laughed and said, "Thanks, but I was talking about this." He showed me a letter addressed to Mike Heese. It had been put in my dad's box by mistake. Neither the name nor box number were even close to my dad's, so why he got it is a mystery. But we thought it was bizarre that he had got that letter on what was probably the only time that he ever had a reason to say "my keys" to me. Story 19. I was at the ballet with my son and took him to the restroom. A woman slipped into the men's room to avoid the long lines for the women's room. When she came out of the stall, she gave a sort of curt head nod toward us and said, "Ladies," in a mock formal tone, just sort of making light of the mild awkwardness of the situation. A couple hours later, we're heading back toward the car, passing through a massive crowd. My son points out an older man who looks a lot like me and is wearing the same flat cap and jacket. He says, "It's your future you." I cracked a joke about how I must have traveled back in time to warn myself about the woman in the men's room so that I'd have a humorous retort to her ladies' comment. That exact moment, the woman from the restroom passed by. Story 20. Went to preschool in my hometown 25 plus years ago. At the time, was friends with lots of kids, and my mom was friends with their parents. Flash forward to a few years ago. I've moved way upstate and was dating a guy in a fraternity. My parents end up moving to a house in a nearby town and need help unpacking. So my then BF asks around his fraternity to see if anyone wants to help. One guy volunteers, and we all go to my parents' house to help. My mom has always been very interested in people, so she basically starts interviewing. Turns out, yep, he's one of the kids I was friends with in preschool. Story 21. My first job was in the food service industry. Woman 1 comes in, I take her order and start preparing it. As I'm doing this, woman 2 walks in. I think nothing of it, just the next customer. I turned my back, made woman 1 food, and by the time I turned around, woman 1 was hysterically crying. I had my back turned for maybe 1 minute, so I'm just wondering what on earth has happened. Turns out, woman 2 was her child. She gave up for adoption, and their meeting here at the store was a total coincidence, and I believe it was the first time they've met. I didn't see the initial encounter or hear any words exchanged at first, so I'm not quite sure how they arrived at that conclusion, unfortunately. They shared a meal together with a lot of tears. Life really is funny like that. Story 22, I, 52, got road raged by what I thought was a teenage girl. I decided to follow her home to one, make sure she was okay, and 2, to teach her a lesson and potentially inform her parents. She put other people's lives at risk and was going 65 in a 45 through a rural town where I work. She was driving recklessly and very fast through the hills, and I was able to figure out where her house was. It was a fancy house with a long driveway. I parked at the bottom and made note of the address planning to write a letter. I could see her pointing down at my truck with a man standing. I went home and told my contractor husband. It turned out to be one of his customers. She's not a teenager at all, but a spoiled rich lady on a rage bender. He just did a job for them last week. She got a different car. The moral of the story is, don't road rage people and then go home. They can follow you and know where you live. Luckily, I'm mostly harmless. Story 23. I was at Glastonbury Festival about 12 years ago. I went on my own, met up with a few friends, and had a good time as always. About 10 days later, I got an email from a woman who I dated a few years before that. Hadn't heard from her since we split. The email was titled, "Is this you?" And attached to the email was a photograph. The picture showed me walking past her camera. She too had been to the festival and was watching the Stranglers on the other stage at Glastonbury, and took a photo of the stage just as I walked past her camera, beer in hand. My hair had grown a lot longer, and I was wearing a hat and sunglasses, but she recognized my pierced ear. There were around 170,000 people there that year, and I walked past her just as she took a photo. Story 24. A while back, I had a friend who traveled frequently for business. She was in town, and we decided we'd make arrangements to go to dinner. The town is Toronto, fifth biggest in North America. I live just outside, she's somewhere deep within. We started texting mid morning, but as we were both doing things, it took a couple of hours. I had to take my kid down to the downtown uni bookstore. She was running around and making arrangements to meet someone she was mentoring. Finally done at the bookstore, still texting dinner arrangements, I suggested to my kid we grab a coffee at a nearby coffee shop, Tim's, having been there once or twice. Get there, get coffee, and sit down to finalize dinner plan. Finally, get agreement and hit the "Great, see you then" text, look up. And amazingly, she's walking through the door of that same coffee shop, reading the text I just sent with the person she was mentoring. We locked eyes and stared at each other for several seconds, marveling at the sheer coincidence and timing. She later admitted she had never been to that coffee shop before. Story 25. Back in the 90s, my friend Steve and I met up in Baltimore to go to an Orioles game. I got to the agreed upon bar a little late, and Steve said he had been there a while and was talking with a young couple who had left for the game before I got there. We scalped some bleacher seats and went into the stadium, hoping we would be able to move up to better seats during the game. This was only a year or two after Camden Yards had opened and it was sold out every game, so we weren't too optimistic. But I happened to spot a couple of empty seats about 20 rows behind the first base dugout. We made our way down there, and I asked the girl next to the empty seats if anyone was using them. She turned around and looked at us and said, "Oh my God, it's Steve." Out of about 45000 seats in a sold out ballpark, we happened to find empty seats next to the couple that Steve had been talking to in the bar. Story 26. A few years ago, I met my ex GFS parents for the first time. Keep in mind, my ex lived an hour and a half away in a different state. Anyways, somehow we got to talking about my single life before I met my ex. So I told them the last date I was on and how boring this girl was, and how she was the owner of some horse farm. The dad then said his work friend just started talking to a girl who owned a horse farm. Sure enough, as we got to talking, we started putting the pieces together. I looked her up on Facebook, not actually believing that this could be the same girl, but it absolutely was. What are the chances that an hour and a half away, my ex's father's coworker started dating a girl I had just been on a date with a month ago? We all ended up laughing, and about 6 months later, I heard they ended up breaking up. Story 27. I work in a tire store. I had a lady call about picking up a set of 4 tires that she was going to pick up for her boyfriend to install. No big deal, we have people do that all the time. She's super rude, though, the whole phone call, and says she's going to be there at 5:50. 5:50 rolls around, and a super rude lady shows up and asks to pick up the tires that she called about earlier. I hit her with the, "Yeah, let me just grab those really quick," as I ran back and rolled them all up to the counter. She looked very surprised as she pointed at them and said, "Those aren't for my car." At the same time, my coworker looked at the tires I had and told me that the lady he was working with was picking those up. One was picking tires up for her Ford Escape, while the other one was getting tires for a Chevy Cobalt. What had happened was, they both called, they both sounded the same. They both had nearly identical redneck, bad independent cow, don't take crap from nobody personalities. One got me on the phone and one got my coworker, and they were both picking up tires, cash, and carry for their boyfriend to install. It would turn out it was the same boyfriend, and they got into a yelling match in the parking lot.